off your suit.
Hello, beautiful people. I'm Oliver Perrin, and welcome to a safer space. I'm posting here instead of on my other channel, Semi-Agog, because YouTube moved to crush that channel with 3 content strikes in order to remove it. So I had to lock it all down and move to a second channel in order not to lose everything. So please subscribe to this channel and stay subscribed to Semi-Agog. It'll be a little over a month before things return to normal. In the meantime, please bear with me, and thanks as always for your continuing support. Now that we have all of that out of the way, the subject this evening will be nationalism and commies. But let's start with nationalism. I recently saw the results of a survey taken by the New Paradigm Review. It included questions about the alt-right brand and attitudes surrounding all of that. Among these was one question asking respondents to indicate their preferred name for the movement. Nationalism came in at number 2. I won't mention the other suggestions because I think all of them except nationalism really suck. And I want to get to further discussion of what this term means, so I won't have anything else to say about this survey, which I'll link to in the description box. But I think questionnaires like this one, surveys like this one, are a great idea. And there should be lots more of them. Anyway, in one form or another, nationalism has been around for a very long time. Ancient examples of nations include the Romans. The Jews, who themselves led revolts against the aforementioned Romans in the 2nd century AD, are another obvious example. There are, of course, many such examples. This is entirely unsurprising, given that a nation is simply a human community that shares a common culture, language, ancestral homeland, and often the same religion, laws, and ethnicity. But that's not how most of the academics like to think about nationalism today. Instead, they choose to see it as a phenomenon that emerged and spread only in the 18th and 19th centuries. One reason for this is that many academics are communists, whether in the larval stage of socialism or as fellow travelers and useful idiots, to say nothing of those who are fully aware of what they're doing and why. Some aim to destroy all competing forms of government. Others, consciously or unconsciously, accept the fundamental communist framework of assumptions, like the idea that all social dynamics can be reduced to a framework of oppressor versus oppressed, or that we should take from each according to his or her ability and distribute according to need, or that everyone should share ownership of everything, though most have never bothered to think these ideas through, and fewer still want to review the disasters that have ensued when attempts were made to put all of this horseshit into practice. So the communists and their pawns will do anything they can to portray nationalism as a recent phenomenon, and one that we should all be trying to move past, given that an excess of nationalism is seen as having caused all the horrors of World War II. In short, we're told that nationalism is a recent thing, and that it caused nothing but pain and suffering, so we should all forget about it, and instead embrace socialism, so as to weld nations together, and one day perhaps even usher in the glorious, intersectional, globalist utopia that we've all been promised. Anyway, the commies don't like their nationalism, so they engage in their usual games, trying to reshape reality by fucking around with definitions in ways most people don't notice. But let's try to form a more precise picture. In order to better understand what the socialists and cultural Marxists are up to, let's do what I often do. Let's take a look at words and where they come from. A quick review of the words used to describe nations, countries, or states reveals the basic foundations for how we think about these things, how we conceptualize them, and it reveals three major aspects of how we define them. One way is to distinguish these social groupings based on their institutions and political conventions. Another is to distinguish based on territory. And yet another is to distinguish based on relationships among the people they comprise. Let's start with the idea of social institutions, the most notable example being government itself, whatever its form. This aspect of how nations are distinguished is clearly reflected in our word state, which comes from Latin roots that mean to be upright, to stand or set forth, as well as to stay and to remain. The word only recently came to be used in the sense it is understood today, meaning the political organization of a country. In its origins, it goes back to the idea of something that was raised and still stands. This is a fundamental, non-arbitrary metaphor for the transmission of social conventions across generations, once upon a time embodied in raised stones or columns bearing codes or laws, and more recently in the form of charters or constitutions. The thing set up, the thing raised, is the thing that outlives each generation. Doesn't matter if it's the stele bearing the inscribed code of Hammurabi, Solon's rotating cylinders covered in inscribed laws, or the US Constitution. Note that even the word constitution goes back to the same roots. The idea of literally setting something up, raising it, establishing it, putting it into place. Next, we have the idea of an area or region. The fundamental notion here is one of territory. In this case, the word country fits this dimension best. At its roots, this word meant things like the surrounding lands, or something like region or area. Eventually, it came to be applied to rural areas, and even to one's native land as a whole. The word land also applied to territory, and the old words and their various descendants in other languages, all related to our English word land, carried the strong sense of a definite territory associated either with an individual owner or a group of people, a nation, which claimed that territory as their home. Which brings us neatly to the third way we distinguish nations in the sense that we use the word today. In addition to the form of government and claims to territory, there is the central notion of a particular people carrying a particular identity. Nation, native, natal, and even natural all go back to Latin roots that conveyed the sense of being born. Looking for related words, they come forth in a cluster that perfectly reveals the interrelated themes that go with the idea of a nation: birth, growth, the natural course of things, natural character, innate disposition, and essence. No matter what the communist rearrangers of letters claim, it can be no accident that all these senses come together in a richly attested constellation of meaning going back thousands of years. The idea is that a nation of people shares a certain nature as a result of being born in a particular region and into their native culture, and that this is just natural. Notice that this facet of collective identity, the nation as a grouping of people, encompasses the other two. By this I mean social institutions and territory, in that it includes the idea of coming from a particular place and sharing institutions, which of course are usually cultural, political, and religious, though all these terms begin to overlap after a point, and all that's perfectly natural. Now we can come back to the communist program of deconstructing the West. If one wants to change the map, if one wishes to play the great game, and the communists certainly do play that game, there are three basic ways to change the circumstances on the game board. The first is to subvert the institutions. The second is to conquer the territory. And the third is to manipulate the population in ways that subvert the institutions and change the lines on the map. Now, we're just dividing these approaches for purposes of conversation in order to more starkly distinguish them. In reality, one usually sees a combination of these things. We've seen a communist subversion of our institutions, notably under FDR and then under LBJ, though the process has continued more or less uninterrupted since then. But subversion of institutions is a vast subject that we don't have time to go into now. Turning to the second method, we all know about grand struggles for territory, such as the Revolutionary War in North America, the US Revolutionary War, or the Texas Revolution. The most direct way to capture territory is to make war, and this approach has been used again and again across thousands of years. There are any number of indirect ways to do this as well. We've seen acquisition of large amounts of territory through payment, such as the Louisiana Purchase, and later the Alaska Purchase. There are other possibilities as well, but instead of going down that rabbit hole, we'll focus on the indirect method that's most relevant to our circumstances today. So let's set aside direct subversion of institutions and the most common methods for capturing territory. Our focus from here on out will be the favored communist technique of achieving both those things and more through the manipulation of peoples, the seizing of power through the creation of new categories of people, or by outlawing old categories. From the communist perspective, nationalism is nothing more and nothing less than a loose set of ideas that can be used to split people apart or weld them together based on the introduction of novel categories or the removal of old ones. Again, at the risk of annoying all of you, I will say it again. The most important thing to understand about nations is that they're tools for stitching things together or cutting them apart. The nation as tool, again, nothing more than a flexible category, it's very important to remember, is purpose-built to divide or unite. It is possible to split the Frankish Empire to form something like French and German regions, smash the Holy Roman Empire's cohesion, launch the 30 Years' War, and put the Habsburgs on notice, then split that empire, create a patchwork of German princely states, divide them against others, Prussian against Habsburg, for example, change the map, and bring many states together to form the German Confederation after Napoleon, unite those states under Bismarck backed by Prussian power, extend those states under Hitler, ostensibly to gather together the rest of the far-flung German peoples, split them again to balance power between NATO and the USSR with East and West Germany, unite them again to form an economic union with Germany itself at the center, and in turn split that larger entity yet again, perhaps. Once more, the important point is that nations are tools for welding disparate peoples together, as we can see in the examples of Yugoslavia or Spain, or on a larger scale with the EU itself, hence the interest in EU flags and currency and anthems, and the misty-eyed talk of Europe. And again, they are tools for tearing groups apart, as we can see in the cases of Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Serbia, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, or more recently the Donbass, or Catalonia. Everything about ethnic nationalism, as we've seen, is entirely natural, in the sense that this is how human beings have chosen to organize themselves since time immemorial, though of course continuously integrating and redefining criteria for inclusion and exclusion across the centuries. Of course, the nations we have today were cobbled together fairly recently, though often on the basis of much older territorial divisions. That means there's nothing really homogeneous about modern European nations like Spain, where at least 4 languages are spoken and bloody civil war remains within living memory, if only just. So even before the subversive activities of the communists began to bear fruit, most European nations amounted to post-imperial compromises intended to prevent further splintering into smaller and smaller states. Large-scale utopian revolutionary agitation goes back to at least 1848, if not earlier in some form or another. After all, before there were commies, there were Jacobins who operated in much the same way, but that's a subject for another day. Even today, and even outside of Europe, nations are almost always compromises. That's all I'm trying to say. Compromises that jam people together into fictional unities. Anyone with eyes to see can see that Israel is not ethnically homogenous. Brazil isn't. India isn't. China certainly isn't. Japan, on the other hand, is probably one of the best examples of a highly functional, contemporary, ethno-nationalist state. So, what about civic nationalism? With CivNat, as they like to call it, as you all doubtless already know, you have the idea that people come together based on shared ideals. Though there are older Roman roots, much of this can be traced back to Christianity and, of course, Christendom. Recognizing shared religious affiliation is not the same thing as taking an oath of citizenship to express support for an ideology, but the former probably cleared the ground and introduced the universal perspective necessary to make the latter a possibility. Territory occupied by Christians was conceived as Christendom and understood as a somewhat unified whole based on the fact that the majority of people living within that territory were Christian. While this was certainly no guarantee of peace, it led the peoples of Europe to look at each other as closely related, and it provided a framework for cooperation in periods of crisis. Further back still, even the Romans eventually made citizenship more widely available, extending it first to other allied states within the Italian peninsula, and eventually expanding access to it further across the Roman world in more limited forms, showing that membership in the nation, in this case more loosely construed, could be based on acceptance of a set of social and political standards. Turning to the New World, civic nationalism introduced a way to bring Europeans together in the US based on native birth into that community, or through a probationary period culminating in the formal acceptance of national ideals. This worked very well for a time, very well indeed. In less than 200 years, the US emerged as the most powerful country in the world. But all of this has changed. We've gone from emphasis upon what the US actually is, a constitutional republic, to emphasis on the fact that it can also be described as a representative democracy. From there, the emphasis has somehow leapfrogged to democracy alone. And more recently still, the emphasis is being put on democratic socialism. The thinking goes that if we're a democracy and enough people want socialism, then that's what we should have. And if we don't have enough people who want to change things, all we have to do is bring more in and allow them to vote. Communists in action, whipping forward their hungry hordes of useful idiots. Against this ongoing commie subversion, there are still those who doggedly assert that citizenship should be based on acceptance of the ideals reflected in our founding documents. This is why new citizens swear an oath to defend the Constitution and the laws of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And it's even called a naturalization oath, for those who might have missed my previous point about the connections between nation, natural, nature, and native. But when it comes to US naturalization, that's pretty much it. There's no way to tell whether the person is swearing a false oath. There's been no interest shown in any form of further ideological testing to determine whether or not the person in question actually holds the ideals they swear to defend. And that's leaving aside the thorny question of whether any such test is possible, whether any such test could be relied upon to be accurate. Even polygraph tests are notoriously unreliable. And we're not even broaching this subject here of how much time testing would take if some means could be established. So what can be done? I don't know. But this is a very real question that we should all be seeking to answer, so we should give it real thought. In the meantime, though, let's look at religion again as a kind of parallel example of how acceptance of ideological convictions plays out. Look at how unreliable claims of deeply held faith can be. We've not only got the many historical examples of conversos who accepted Christianity under threat of death only to return to their original faith once they were again safe. There's also the whole doctrine of taqiyya among Muslims, allowing them in certain circumstances to lie about their faith. Or take the example of convicts who come to Jesus in order to make themselves more attractive to parole boards. Or the example of people who pretend to accept a particular faith in order to receive hot meals and showers. How are we supposed to test people in order to determine whether they share our beliefs and ideals, or if they're instead simply willing to lie in order to get lots of great things for free? This is not a rhetorical question. Again, it's a question we really need to be thinking about. I have a lot more thinking to do in this regard, and I could ramble on about all of this for quite a bit longer. For now, my attention is on the fact that commies and jihadis have allied to exploit our civic nationalism, which, in the absence of any meaningful ideological test, leaves the door open for programs of subversion of the nation through population replacement, for example. This has led many to see civic and ethnic nationalism as being fundamentally in opposition. I know people like to hear definitive answers that support their existing views. That's just human nature. And most people don't like to come away from watching a video with new questions instead of the satisfying answers that they were looking for. So please forgive me. But I think it's worth our time to consider the reality that the US was initially a combination of civic and ethnic nationalism. This is an undeniable fact. Consider, even if one was white, one still had to be willing to swear an oath to defend the Constitution. And at various points in our history, we barred communists and anarchists, not just from becoming citizens, but from even entering the damn country. And many of those communists and anarchists were white in the expanded sense we understand that term today. Clearly, our system combined civic and ethnic nationalism. But now, the ethnic component has been removed. We are threatened if we even mention that it once existed, if we mention it in anything other than horrified and self-righteous terms. As a consequence, those who focus on white well-being, those mobilizing against anti-white agitators. As a consequence, these people have come to see civic nationalism as directly opposed to ethnic nationalism, or at least many of them. But as I said, the US nation was originally defined based on ethnic or racial criteria and acceptance of our form of government, the constitutional republic. And it was that very combination that enabled the emergence of the category we today call white. This idea of white as a broad racial category seems to me to be a very American thing. And that's another thing I'm currently digging into. More on that later, perhaps. In closing, I want to hammer on this point about the need to combine civic and ethnic nationalism, or what I see as the need to combine civic and ethnic nationalism. When it comes to America, to the United States of America, it seems clear that over the last 100 years, the civic dimension of our nationalism has been subverted and weaponized to destroy the parallel ethnic or racial dimension. Shouldn't we give a bit of real thought to the possibility that now, coming from the other direction, the ethnic or racial dimension of our nation is being mobilized to destroy what remains of the civic one? Such questions really matter. Why, you ask? Because the commies are working hard to splinter the US, to replace the population here, just as they are doing abroad, trying to remake the countries of the West into self-destructive viper pits of multicultural relativism. Or think about it this way. If using the civic dimension against the ethnic dimension of our national character has been a really effective way to plunge the country into increasing chaos, why wouldn't the same manipulators be using the ethnic dimension to destroy the civic one at the same time? To understand why the utopian hive minders would be doing this, all we have to do is look at the product that would emerge when the ethnic and civic dimensions have been driven against each other and fractured. All that will remain is agitated identity groups, all of them convinced that they can no longer live together and that civic nationalism, more specifically our American constitutional republic, was the cause of it all. And what's the solution that we keep hearing more and more about? Well, it's socialism, of course. Have a look at Marxist dialectics, the undead heart of their worldview and thinking. It postulates three laws: the law of unity and conflict of opposites, the law of the passage of quantitative change into qualitative change, and the law of the negation of the negation. Think about these three postulates, and again, consider how the unity of the American national character, both civic and ethnic, is being continuously splintered into two seemingly warring opposites, civic and ethnic nationalism. Think about how quantitative changes in demographics are being used to create qualitatively different attitudes about our national covenant. For example, the notion that we have to get rid of civic nationalism and replace it with white national socialism. And think about how at the end of this process, after our national unity has been cleft into its two components, after both of these aspects are used to inflame passions against the other, in the end, both will be subsumed. Each is used to negate the other, and in the end, both are gone. Again, I have to give this much more thought, but I can say this. By my lights, ethnic nationalism alone is not enough. As an American, I'm beginning to think the key to some sort of resolution of all of this lies in recombining, returning to the combination of ethnic and civic nationalism, approaching it just as our forefathers here in the US did. If nothing else, we should certainly, of this I'm quite sure, if nothing else, we should certainly dump the whole heap of bullshit about how civic and ethnic nationalism are two mutually exclusive alternatives. Otherwise, we'll be left facing just two shitty choices. We can all risk becoming members of a dwindling and despised white minority in the New World, leaving aside Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Europe, and the rest. Or we can face the prospect of seeing our constitutional republic overturned in favor of the latest nationalist flavor of socialism. And once the various white nations share socialism as their common denominator, the commies will be just that much further along. I expect I'll have more to say on all of this, but for now, this preliminary surface scratching will have to do. Until next time, I'm out.